Normandy, June 1944. The morning air is heavy with smoke and diesel. German tanks grind across a narrow French road, their turrets sweeping toward distant thunder. Then, the sound. A deep, tearing roar from above. Not the slow drone of a bomber, but something faster, angrier. Shadows cross the fields, wings flashing silver, sunlight glinting off machine guns. A commander leans out of his hatch, scanning the clouds. Too late. The sky erupts. Rockets scream downward, tearing into steel. A panther explodes in a burst of flame. Another veers off the road, burning. The survivors stare upward in disbelief. This isn't artillery. It's a new kind of predator. One that hunts from the heavens. In the early years of World War II, nothing on Earth seemed capable of stopping German armor. The sight of panzer divisions rolling across Europe became the symbol of Nazi dominance. Steel moving with purpose, precision, and speed. From the plains of Poland to the fields of France, the blitzkrieg unfolded like a storm. Columns of tanks, half-tracks, and motorized infantry cut through defenses that had stood for decades. Their philosophy was simple: strike fast, strike deep, never let the enemy recover. Each advance was coordinated through radio networks, supported by artillery, engineers, and close air support from the feared Stuka dive bombers. In 1939, this fusion of technology and tempo seemed unstoppable. French and British commanders, trained in the slow wars of the past, were left stunned. By June 1940, France had fallen, its mighty Maginot Line outflanked and irrelevant. German tanks, from the nimble Panzer III to the heavy Panzer IV, were not just machines. They were psychological weapons. Their presence alone could cause entire divisions to retreat. The myth of the invincible Panzer began here. And it endured. Even in the deserts of North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps showed how armor, used boldly, could rewrite the laws of mobility. His tanks danced across the sands, outmaneuvering British formations and earning him the name Desert Fox. Everywhere the Wehrmacht advanced, the lesson was the same: whoever commanded the tanks commanded the battlefield. The Allies tried to fight back, but their early weapons lagged behind. British Crusader and Matilda tanks were slow and undergunned. American Shermans were reliable, but thin-skinned against the larger German guns. Air forces remained focused on strategic bombing or dogfights, rarely coordinating effectively with ground troops. To most Allied commanders in 1941 and 1942, the idea of stopping a panzer division from the air sounded impossible. Aircraft were fragile, unpredictable, and short on endurance. Tanks were armored fortresses, fireproof against anything that didn't hit directly from the side or rear. But in the backrooms of Allied planning offices, in Britain, in Washington, in Soviet design bureaus, engineers were asking a different question. What if the answer to the tank didn't come from the ground, but from the sky? That question would lead to an innovation that turned disbelief into terror. It would spawn aircraft so rugged, so devastating, that German tank commanders would come to fear open ground, even on a clear day. For now, though, in 1942, the German tank was still the master. Its shadow covered continents, its power unchallenged. But above that shadow, somewhere beyond the clouds, something new was being built, quietly, methodically, and with one mission: to end the age of the Panzer. By 1942, the Allies were bleeding on every front. German tanks ruled the open plains of Russia, the deserts of Africa, and the hedgerows of Europe. Each new campaign brought reports of panzers advancing almost untouched by conventional airstrikes. Traditional bombers, even when they hit, often failed to destroy their targets. A near miss meant nothing to a Tiger or Panther. And the idea of using fighters to attack tanks was still considered reckless, until engineers started to question why it had to be. In Britain, A team at Hawker Aircraft began modifying their rugged Typhoon fighter. Originally designed to counter the Luftwaffe's FW-190s, the Typhoon's thick wings and powerful Napier Sabre engine gave it a new, deadly potential. By attaching rockets beneath its wings, 60-pound armor-piercing warheads, the Typhoon became the first true tank buster in the West. Across the Atlantic, in American factories, another revolution was brewing. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive, heavily armed fighter, was entering service. Pilots called it the Jug. It was fast, durable, and carried 850 caliber machine guns, bombs, and rockets. Unlike earlier planes, it could dive at tremendous speed, unleash devastation, and pull out again. A flying fortress in miniature. At first, it was used as a high-altitude escort. But, as Allied air superiority grew, commanders realized its true strength lay closer to the ground. The P-47 could absorb hits that would destroy lesser planes. It could loiter above battlefields, strike with precision, and survive. In Soviet factories east of the Urals, another masterpiece was already rewriting air warfare. The Ilyushin Il-2T, Tau-2 Sturmovik. Built from steel and armored glass, it was practically a flying tank. German soldiers nicknamed it Der Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. It flew low, slow, and merciless, using cannons and rockets to rip through armored columns. By 1943, entire German panzer divisions on the Eastern Front were learning to fear its shadow. Each of these aircraft, the Typhoon, the Thunderbolt, the Sturmovik, represented a new philosophy. They weren't designed to win dogfights. They were designed to annihilate the battlefield. And as these machines evolved, Allied pilots evolved with them. They learned to strike tanks from behind, where armor was weakest. They studied convoy formations, camouflage, and fuel points. They trained not to hunt aircraft, but to hunt steel. By mid-1944, these experiments were ready for war. The Typhoon squadrons gathered in southern England. The Thunderbolts lined up on dusty airfields in Normandy. The Sturmoviks darkened the skies above Kursk and Belarus. None of them yet knew the scale of what was coming. But within months, German tank commanders, once confident kings of the battlefield, would find themselves staring at a new kind of enemy. Not across the horizon, but from above. Angle 1, the tactical revolution before 1943, the battlefield had a simple hierarchy. Tanks ruled the ground, and aircraft ruled the sky. Each fought in its own realm, until the ground attack aircraft blurred that line completely. When the first squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons began supporting Allied ground forces, their commanders were unsure what to expect. These were not light, nimble fighters. They were heavy, almost brutish, designed to carry more firepower than finesse. But that weight became their greatest advantage. The Thunderbolt could dive at nearly 500 miles per hour, releasing bombs or rockets with pinpoint precision. It could then pull out of its dive through smoke and anti-aircraft fire, shrugging off damage that would have torn lesser aircraft apart. Allied troops on the ground quickly learned to love their presence. Whenever the deep rumble of radial engines rolled over the horizon, morale surged. German tank columns, once free to maneuver at will, now found themselves trapped in a deadly triangle. Infantry below, artillery ahead, and fighter bombers above. Tactics evolved almost overnight. Tank commanders were forced to scatter, conceal, and move only under cover of night. Even the famed Panzer-Lehr Division, once an elite armored force, lost its mobility under the constant threat of air attack. For the first time in the war, tanks were being hunted, and the hunters never had to expose themselves to return fire. Angle 2, the technological edge, weaponry that made these aircraft so effective, was the result of relentless experimentation. The British developed 3-inch rockets, fitted with solid armor-piercing warheads, capable of punching through the top plating of a Tiger tank. American engineers perfected 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, designed to travel faster, strike straighter, and hit harder than any weapon carried by a plane before. The P-47 carried 8 machine guns, each firing 800 rounds per minute, shredding truck convoys, fuel dumps, and soft targets with brutal efficiency. Under its wings, it could mount 2 500-pound bombs or up to 10 rockets. It was, quite literally, a flying artillery platform. The Typhoon, meanwhile, became the terror of Normandy. Its rocket salvos could wipe out entire armored columns within seconds. German reports from July 1944 describe units being caught in a storm of fire from unseen aircraft, an early recognition of the changing nature of warfare. The Soviets took another path: brute durability. The IL-2 was sheathed in armor plating so thick that German rifle bullets bounced off its fuselage. Its 23mm cannons tore through half-tracks and light armor like paper. By the end of the war, over 36,000 Sturmovix had been built, the single most produced military aircraft in history. Technology had done something profound. It had flipped the logic of war. For the first time, speed and air power were more decisive than tonnage and armor. The tank, the symbol of unstoppable force, could now be destroyed by a single rocket from the clouds. That realization hit German commanders harder than any bomb. Their best weapon had suddenly become their greatest liability, and as the skies filled with thunder, every advance began to feel like a trap waiting to be sprung. Angle 3. The human experience. Inside the iron coffin, for German tank crews, life inside a Panzer had once felt invincible. The thick steel walls, the mechanical rhythm of the engine, the reassuring clatter of treads, all gave the illusion of safety. Even artillery shells, unless they struck directly, could be endured. But by 1944, that illusion was gone. The first sign was sound. Pilots of Thunderbolts or Typhoons described how tank columns would instantly halt when they heard engines overhead. Crews would bail out, scatter for cover, abandoning their machines, sometimes before a single shot was fired. The noise of an approaching fighter bomber became as terrifying as the explosion itself. One captured German officer admitted, "When we heard the roar of the jabos, we no longer thought of fighting. We thought of hiding." Inside a tank, the experience was claustrophobic and helpless. You couldn't see the sky clearly. You could only hear the engines closing in, the scream of rockets, and the violent shock as they struck nearby. Even a near miss could flip a tank, rupture tracks, or set off ammunition. Some crews took to driving only at night, engines off during daylight. Others dug their tanks into the ground, half buried in camouflage, praying to be mistaken for wreckage. The tank, once the hunter, had become prey. For the first time since 1939, German armored units found themselves afraid to move, not because of ground resistance, but because of the sky itself. Angle 4. The psychological war. Fear from above, the Luftwaffe had once been the masters of fear. Their Stukas, with sirens mounted on their wings, had spread terror during the Blitzkrieg. But by 1944, the Germans were tasting their own medicine. Every Allied advance in Western Europe was preceded and protected by air power. Pilots in P-47s and Typhoons operated in pairs or fours, patrolling for movement. The moment they spotted a convoy, they struck with surgical ferocity. Reports from Panzer units during the Normandy campaign describe the demoralizing effect. Entire battalions refused to move in daylight. Supply trucks arrived half-empty, their drivers too terrified to complete the journey. Fuel shortages worsened, not from lack of resources, but from fear. One Wehrmacht commander wrote bitterly in August 1944, Our tanks are destroyed not in battle, but in retreat. The enemy flies faster than we can flee. This fear wasn't just tactical, it was existential. It shattered the Wehrmacht's greatest advantage: confidence. German soldiers had been trained to believe that discipline and technology could overcome anything. But now, even the best tank couldn't guarantee survival. For Allied troops, the psychological effect was the opposite. They looked to the skies for salvation. To see a squadron of thunderbolts or typhoons meant protection, proof that the Allies controlled not just the land, but the very elements. The P-47s and Typhoons became symbols of inevitability. They didn't just destroy targets, they broke the will to fight. German tank commanders began describing the battlefield as untenable under daylight. The once feared panzer divisions, masters of blitzkrieg, now moved cautiously. Tentatively, like hunted animals, it was more than a tactical defeat. It was the moment when the myth of the panzer, the invincible steel beast, was finally broken. And as 1944 turned to 1945, that broken myth would meet its final test, in the burning fields of Normandy and the icy forests of the Ardennes, where air power would decide the fate of the German war machine. June 7, 1944. The beaches of Normandy are still smoldering from the landings. Allied troops are fighting inland, clawing through hedgerows and minefields. But above them, another battle is taking shape. One that will determine the fate of every tank on the ground. The Luftwaffe is a shadow of its former self. Most of its experienced pilots are dead or grounded, its fuel reserves nearly gone. For the first time in the war, the German army must fight without control of the sky. At dawn, Allied reconnaissance planes circle high above the French countryside. Below, panzer divisions, Lehr, 12th SS Hitlerjugend, 2nd Panzer, rumble forward to crush the invasion before it expands. They expect to fight infantry and artillery. Instead, they are met by the thunder of engines descending from the clouds. P-47. Thunderbolts sweep in first. Their pilots fly low, so low they can see the tracks churning the dirt. Rockets streak downward, slamming into half-tracks and supply vehicles. Then come the Typhoons, screaming in with 20mm cannons blazing. Explosions ripple through the narrow country roads. Fuel trucks erupting, ammunition wagons vanishing in fire. In minutes, precision chaos takes hold. The Allied pilots are operating under a new doctrine: cab rank. Fighter bombers circle above the battlefield in rotations, ready to strike any target identified by ground observers. The radio calls come non-stop. Tanks in the orchard east of Villers-Bocage. Within minutes, the sky answers. German tank commanders try to scatter, to hide beneath trees or camouflage nets. But the countryside betrays them. Dust trails reveal movement. Reflections from open hatches flash in the sun. Even the thick bocage, those centuries-old hedgerows, cannot shield them forever. One Typhoon squadron commander described it later. It was hunting, pure and simple. Once we saw them, there was nowhere for them to go. By late June, the German 2nd Panzer Division reports losing over 60% of its armor. Most of it not in tank duels, but to rocket and bomb strikes. The elite Panzer Lehr Division, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, is shredded trying to reach the front. Over 200 vehicles are destroyed or abandoned within days. Survivors recall fields littered with blackened wrecks. Tigers and panthers split open like tin cans. The smell of fuel and burning rubber hung in the air for weeks. Crews who had once charged forward now refused to move by daylight. Allied intelligence soon realized they had achieved something unprecedented. Not just air superiority, but air supremacy over armor. For the German command, the shock was total. Reports flooded Berlin describing massive material losses due to low-level, Attacks. Field Marshal von Klug warned that our armored movements are no longer possible except at night. Even Rommel, master of maneuver warfare, admitted that daylight operations had become suicidal. He would later tell his superiors, "The enemy's air force impedes every movement. It is no longer possible to bring up supplies or reserves by day." By July 1944, the outcome was irreversible. German armor, once the spearhead of every offensive, had become a defensive liability. The sky, once the realm of reconnaissance, was now the executioner. And in that realization, a generation of German tank commanders felt the ground shift beneath them. Their steel giants were no longer kings. They were targets. While German tank divisions burned in Normandy, the same nightmare unfolded thousands of miles away, across the fields of Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland. It was summer 1944. The Red Army had launched Operation Bagration, one of the largest offensives in human history. Over 2 million Soviet soldiers surged westward to destroy Army Group Center. But this time, it wasn't just the tanks or artillery that terrified the Germans. It was the sound that came before destruction. The shrieking dive of the IL-2 Skortfiu. Turawa, the Soviet flying tank, nicknamed Schwarzer Tod, Black Death, by German infantry, the IL-2 became the Eastern Front's version of the Typhoon. Armored beneath, armed with cannons, rockets, and bombs, it could fly low and strike tanks head-on. Each squadron flew dozens of sorties a day, operating in relentless waves. German columns caught on open roads stood no chance. The first sign was often a glint in the sky. Then a thunderous explosion as a Sturmovik's rockets tore through the lead vehicle. Trapped between burning wrecks and strafing runs, crews abandoned their tanks and fled into ditches. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but by mid-1944, its fighter strength on the Eastern Front was a fraction of what it once was. Fuel shortages, lack of experienced pilots, and relentless Soviet pressure meant the Sturmoviks could operate almost freely. Entire armored regiments vanished under their assault. At Mogilev, Bobruisk, and Orsha, Soviet air units obliterated convoys before they ever reached the front. Captured German reports read like cries of despair. Movement during daylight is impossible. Columns annihilated by low-flying aircraft. No defense remains against these attacks. One veteran panzer commander, Karl Kerner, later wrote that his men feared the Sturmovik more than any enemy tank. He recalled days when we dug trenches not for ourselves, but for our vehicles, hoping to hide them from the sky. For decades, German doctrine had built its power on speed and concentration. Now, that very philosophy was turned against them, wherever they gathered, to refuel, to resupply, to counterattack. Allied and Soviet pilots found them first. And behind those tactical victories lay a deeper shift, the final realization that air power had become the ultimate weapon of strategy. The age of pure armor dominance, from Poland to France to the early days of Barbarossa, was over. The sky now decided the fate of armies. Rommel, watching the same disaster unfold in Normandy, had already grasped it. His famous remark after inspecting the front lines became prophetic. "If I cannot move my armor by day, I have lost the war." On both fronts, west and east, German commanders faced the same truth. Their most feared weapons, their pride and confidence, were helpless under the shadow of Allied and Soviet aircraft. The secret plane that had shocked them, whether the Typhoon over France or the Sturmovik over Belarus, was not merely a machine. It was a symbol of a new era, where control of the air dictated control of the ground. By autumn 1944, tank units that once roared across continents were crawling through forests at night, hiding under camouflage nets by day. And for every mile they moved, The sky waited, listening, watching, ready to strike. The once invincible blitzkrieg had met its counterblow, not from another tank, but from above. And in that turning point, the German High Command realized what many had feared since 1940. The war would now be decided not by steel and oil, but by who owned the sky. By late 1944, the evidence was undeniable. The German Wehrmacht, once built on the unstoppable momentum of tank warfare, was collapsing under skies it no longer controlled. Allied air power had rewritten the rules of war. In Western Europe, the Royal Air Force's Typhoons and the U.S. Army Air Force's P-47 Thunderbolts flew thousands of sorties each week. The results were devastating. Between June and August 1944, during the Battle of Normandy, Allied tactical air forces destroyed or immobilized over 2,500 German armored vehicles and nearly 5,000 transport trucks. Panzer Lehr Division, once considered the finest armored unit in the Wehrmacht, ceased to exist as a fighting force. Out of its 190 tanks, barely 30 remained operational after the first month. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge's staff recorded grimly, "Our supply lines are shattered. Our movement is strangled. Every convoy is a target." The psychological toll was just as severe. Tank crews refused to move during daylight. Mechanics worked only under camouflage, and commanders learned to issue orders in the dark. The daylight, once an ally of speed and vision, had become synonymous with death. In France, Allied pilots referred to this dominance as armed reconnaissance, but to German soldiers, it was something else entirely: permanent exposure. Wherever they went, the eyes of the enemy followed. Even static defenses couldn't escape. Bridges, crossroads, ammunition dumps all became targets. Aerial photographs taken by Allied reconnaissance units show entire stretches of French countryside littered with wrecks. Burned-out trucks, smashed Panthers, and overturned Tigers lay in tangled lines across the narrow hedgerow roads. By August, when the Allies launched Operation Cobra, the German front was already brittle. General Omar Bradley's troops broke through near St. Lo. And this time, the breakout wasn't halted by counterattacks, because there were none. Every armored column that tried to move was hit from the air before reaching the front. The coup de grace came during the Falaise Pocket. August 1944. Over $50,000. German troops and hundreds of vehicles were trapped as Allied air forces turned the escape routes into killing grounds. Typhoon and Thunderbolt squadrons made run after run, their rockets shattering columns of retreating armor. A British pilot recalled, "You could see the tanks trying to turn off the road, but there was nowhere to go. It was a slaughter." The aftermath was filmed by Allied crews days later. Miles of road covered in burned tanks, shattered half-tracks, and twisted corpses. Even hardened soldiers were stunned by the scale of destruction. One observer called it a steel graveyard stretching to the horizon. In those scenes, the myth of German invincibility died. For the first time since 1939, the panzer divisions had no answer, no countermeasure, no counterattack. Air supremacy had done what years of combat could not. It broke the very backbone of blitzkrieg. And as Allied ground forces pushed eastward, the same destruction followed, from France into Belgium, from Belgium into Germany itself. The sky had become the new front line, and the Germans knew they could never win it back. By autumn 1944, the Reich was fighting for its survival, and the humiliation was clear to every commander still in the field. German tank columns no longer dictated the pace of battle. They hid, waiting for night. Every daylight operation carried the same haunting risk: discovery, then annihilation. The Luftwaffe's decline had become irreversible. Factories bombed, fuel reserves drained. Its last hope lay not in numbers, but in technology. Deep inside Germany, Engineers worked around the clock on revolutionary aircraft, jet-powered fighters that might turn the tide. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet, was their answer to the Allied storm. Capable of flying over 540 miles per hour, it could outrun any Allied fighter and strike bombers before they reached German cities. Hitler, however, demanded it be converted into a fighter bomber, a blitz bomber, to attack ground forces. That decision cost precious time and focus. By the time the Me-262 entered combat in mid-1944, the Reich's industrial heart was already bleeding out. Still, the few that flew terrified Allied pilots. Their speed and power hinted at what might have been if Germany had deployed them sooner. But even these jets couldn't change the outcome. There were too few, too late, and the skies were already lost. In the meantime, desperate measures took hold. Tank commanders began covering vehicles with branches, hay, or mud to break up reflections from the air. Some units even painted fake shadows on their hulls to blend with terrain, crude, yet revealing of their fear. The panzer divisions that once spearheaded invasions had become nocturnal, moving like hunted animals. German military doctrine shifted from offensive mobility to static defense. The emphasis turned to camouflage, concealment, and dispersal, lessons that would later form the foundation of post-war tactics around the world. Meanwhile, the Allies documented everything. Aerial footage, strike reports, and after-action analyses poured in. The RAF's Tactical Air Command concluded that fighter bombers had achieved a disproportionate psychological impact, far greater than even their physical destruction suggested. One British report summarized, "Wherever the Typhoon appeared, movement ceased." That alone was victory. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets reached similar conclusions. The IL-2 Sturmovik, once underestimated, became central to Soviet combined arms doctrine. Its success inspired post-war aircraft like the IL-10 and, later, the iconic MiG ground attack lineage. To the Red Army, the Sturmovik had proven that air power could paralyze mechanized warfare. For Germany, it was a bitter education. The same innovation and aggression that once fueled its blitzkrieg had now turned against it. Air dominance had undone the myth of armored supremacy, proving that no amount of steel could survive under an unchallenged sky. By 1945, even the greatest German tanks, Tigers, Panthers, and King Tigers, were reduced to defensive monuments, magnificent in engineering, yet useless without protection from above. And as Allied bombers turned German cities into rubble, and Sturmoviks hunted retreating columns through East Prussia, the message was unmistakable. The future of war no longer rolled on treads. It roared through clouds. That truth would shape every nation's strategy in the decades to come. The age of blitzkrieg had ended. The age of air power had begun. In the end, the story of the secret plane that shocked German tank commanders was not just about aircraft or machines. It was about a turning point in the very logic of war. For centuries, victory had belonged to those who could control the ground. The fastest horses, the strongest tanks, the most disciplined infantry. But by 1944, that order was gone. The sky had taken command. Those who once ruled battlefields from behind armor now looked upward, powerless against unseen predators. The Luftwaffe's fall marked more than the collapse of an air force. It marked the end of an era when wars could be won by maneuver alone. After 1945, every army studied the same lesson. Mobility was meaningless without air cover. Firepower was futile without control above it. And courage, though never absent, could no longer compensate for technological imbalance. The Allied fighter bombers and Soviet Sturmoviks did more than destroy tanks. They reshaped strategy, redefined power, and proved that no empire, no matter how advanced, could fight beneath a hostile sky. From Normandy's hedgerows to the plains of Belarus, A single truth echoed across history. The age of the tank was mortal. But the rule of the sky had only just begun.